Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight to this evening's lecture of The Wit and Wisdom of Mel Brooks, conducted by Joan Baum. And it reminds me of this time last year, we were discussing George Orwell at the same time. So there's a very, very big, happy change between George Orwell and Mel Brooks. I hope you enjoy this evening's lecture. And we also have with us for some insight and some stories, we have Phyllis Italiano with us, Mr. Brooks' sister-in-law. So I am very happy that everybody's here this evening. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Joan Baum. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, East Hampton Library. Thank you, Phyllis. Thank you all for coming here. And thanks to the folks on Zoom whom I can't see, but I do appreciate your attendance. Often when I give a talk, one of the first things someone wants to know is why? Why did I pick this subject? And I love to have reasons. I love to have reasons because it gives me the illusion of order. The last talk, I think I had 6 reasons. And something on the Klansman, I had 7. Today I have 4. And when we get to the 4th, which is going to be pretty fast, don't run for the doors. The first reason I have for wanting to do something on Mel Brooks is it's timely. He's recently published a memoir all about me. And the subtitle is My Remarkable Life in Show Business. And it's important to remember that it's a memoir. It's not an autobiography, cradle to grave, nor is it a biography. And when I bought the book in East Hampton at Bookhampton, I waited to check out, and some woman comes up to me and says, "Is it any good?" And I started to say, no, meaning that there was nothing new in it for me. I was just an insane fan and wanted to buy it. But before I could say anything after the no, we both together said, "But it's Mel Brooks, right?" And I thought, that's remarkable. About how many people can you say something like that? He once said, anyway, that he had always been a huge admirer of my own work. So I thought that was a good enough reason to have a talk. But there were other timely references. Some of you may have seen the movie Tar with Kate Blanchett. And in the movie, she's being interviewed. And she mentions how few people got the 4 winner prizes of Emmy, Oscar, Grammy, and Tony. And Mel Brooks was one. And people in the movie's audience laughed, but so did people in the real theater audience. So there he is, very timely. 2 weeks ago, he had an interview in the New York Times Book Review, ostensibly about the memoir, but he was talking about other more general things. And he also appeared in a movie that I saw in Sag Harbor. It was wonderful, The Automat. And it was something that was so redolent of his humanity. However, he got to do that movie for the kids who made it, he was so welcoming of them and so supportive. And that's worth celebrating. He's 96. That's worth celebrating. 96 and a half, I should say. And to celebrate that kind of creativity at that age is really remarkable. In 2015, he was on television getting an award, the Medal of Arts, presented by Obama, and everybody, young and old, was clapping. So he's got a reputation, even though he's 96, according to the young people who know about him. He's also, reason number 3, he also has East End connections. He lived on Fire Island. He lived in East Hampton for a while. And his sister-in-law, no, he rented. Yes, she's nodding. Okay, we'll get a clarification. Uh, and He orchestrated, I should say, in the automat, which he does for all his movies. He wrote a special song. There is nothing like the coffee at the automat, and full orchestration with all of his movies. And people applauded. They applauded the movie. They called out that they remembered the automat, but they were really celebrating him. And so those are the first three reasons. Now, the fourth and last one, but this one's going to go on for a while. He was for me an occasion to talk about comedy, to celebrate comedy. It's an incredibly complex genre. It's one that I think is still underrated vis-a-vis tragedy. It's one that I wish we all as a community would appreciate better and critically. And of the comedy that he does, his particular kind is what I want to talk about basically. He may hearken to the 60s and 70s or 80s, but he's worth revisiting because his comedy is joyous. It is full of heartening, good humor. It is nostalgic in that sense, but it's never cruel. He does great ridicule, spoof, satire, criticism of all kinds, but he is never less than supportive. And I thought that was worth celebrating too. I'm sure you have the same sensation as I on occasion when you click on the TV and there's somebody who is a comic and that person comes out on stage with an F word and the place just cracks up. I don't get it. But Mel Brooks, whenever he is vulgar, is never without a purpose, never without a human dimension. And so I wanted to celebrate that kind of humor. And it's the kind of humor we need today. It's communal. It grows when you see it, his movies, and listen to the albums with other people. He still stands up in Blazing Saddles. And it's now been 48 years. His good friend Richard Pryor was originally scheduled to be in it. The role was taken over by Clevedon Little. But just last week, I didn't see the show, but I read about it. Oprah chastised someone who was making fun of it and said, "You better watch it. Blazing Saddles, that's holy territory." And of course it is, because what he did almost 50 years ago could not, I believe, be done today. And so the humor that he manifests, the humor that he took on, the humor that I think he initiated or certainly popularized, sets him apart. And particularly, I wanted to discuss the ethnic humor. He, in his memoir, says he doesn't want to be known as someone of Jewish humor, but he thinks the more appropriate reference is New York humor, Brooklyn oriented. Humor, as he says, with reality and a brush stroke of brutality. It's rougher than Jewish comedy per se. As he said, in comedy, you can make fun of someone who walks funny, not in Jewish humor. That would be totally out of the question. And so a lot of his humor is defensive ethnically, but never, ever making fun. Now we're going to get to a side issue that I hope I'm not disappointing everybody with. A mention that we're not going to conclude this by singing the Hitler rap. Uh, and I decided that just a few days ago. The news is bad. The news is very bad. And it's not just Hitler in Germany, despite Germany in the news too. And France with, what was it, 74% increase in anti Semitic events and incidents. And I thought the Hitler rap funny, go home, listen to it, call in a good friend. Terrific disco score, by the way. It it's a little risky to do now and very sensitive. And I thought of something else. I told you I have to number these points because I'm queen of ramble, but it's good to be the queen. Anyway, several years ago, I was curious about a book that was the hottest thing in my high school years. It was called The Amboy Dukes. Woo! And it took place in Brooklyn, but it was really a hot number that everybody in paperback would slide into their other texts and read. And a movie was made from it. It's by Irving Shulman. A movie was made, City Across the River. And I had read the book, and then I was curious about how it would stand up now. And I got hold of a copy. I don't know how I got hold of a copy that was the original publication in 1947. And believe it or not, this has to do with my censoring myself for eliminating the Hitler rap song. As I read the Amboy Dukes, my mouth hung open. All the characters were Jewish. They were not Jewish in the publication that went viral that everybody was reading in the high schools. And that was 2 years later. And the movie 1951, also with Stephen McNally, no Jews at all. And I thought that was remarkable. And I wound up somehow getting hold of the author, Irving Shulman, who was a sociologist at Columbia. And he said, even though he was unhappy that his novel was changed, but now back out again in original form, it was too raw to come out with that novel about Jews who were criminals, who were into gang rape. I mean, it was a denigration, brilliantly done, as a sociologist would do, who was also a novelist, but it was just too raw for the occasion. And so he allowed all the names and all the events to be changed. But I was very happy finally, and so was he, to see the original out because now we have a separation. And when you think about Blazing Saddles, that was 1974. Even though, as Mel Brooks says, he had notes from rabbis galore who complained, and he said he answered every single one of them, there was talk about him aiding and abetting anti-Semitism, but he still had the dates on his side, 1974. And I think from what is happening right now that we read about, it is too raw for me to play this and conclude that this is the heart of Mel Brooks. It's very funny, but it's not what I want to emphasize about his humor. And besides, there was another question that occurred to me. And again, this is a talk based on a lot of last minute observations. The New York Times ran an interview, I think 2 weeks ago, with Tom Stoppard, whose latest play, Leopoldstadt, is about a family in Vienna, assimilated Jews, some of them converted, and it follows their disbelief and their unwilling and unbelieving observation of what was happening until the last sections of the play. What happened to Uncle so and so, what happened to cousin so and so, and you just hear these one word responsive incantations: Auschwitz, Auschwitz, Auschwitz. So here's Tom Stoppard, and here is the interviewer asking him about anti Semitism. Now, the play is not about anti Semitism, it's about the effects of and the lack of recognition. It's a broader, more philosophical and psychological observation, exploration, I should say. But Mel Brooks had first said, if you can reduce your enemy to be an object of ridicule and laughter, you've won. And I now wonder about that. And particularly because Stoppard said just about the same thing 2 weeks ago. How to meet hate and anti Semitism? Meet it with derision and better argument. Well, I think the better argument is a left field response. I can't see that at all. But the question here, and I have no answer, I bring it up because it's something to reflect upon. How do you meet it? And this has been for Mel Brooks so much part of his life in making movies, and his Hitler fetish, as everyone calls it, is his way of trying to mute the horror. Now, what he had on his side, as I said, were dates, unlike Irving Schulman, who was just 2 years barely away from the opening of the camps. So I don't know about that wonderful motive for all of the producers, particularly the great, great satirical and parodic movement to so many of his films. He is due to come out, by the way, with History of the World Part 2. And it's supposed to run in 8 episodes on Hulu. And it's supposed to feature, he's been quoted as saying, Hitler on ice. But I'm now wondering whether that particular episode will go forward. It's a very different, just in the last month or so, at least from the PR. So we will not be concluding with that, but I hope even more so a consideration of why. And I'd love to have Mel Brooks kind of not deny his former motive, because I still think he believes in getting ridicule and satire and parody to move against hate. But like Stoppard, whom I also question in this, I don't know more whether that's sufficient. And maybe one of the reasons is that we're not talking about Germany anymore. We're talking about this country. So that makes a very big difference. I've referred to Brooks as a comic and a comedian. Is there a difference? And who cares? Um, I don't think so. A comic, however, is usually someone we think of as stand up, even though he may have been trained in improv groups and works alone. Comedians, it seems to me, are basically comics and actors. They may ad lib too. And certainly Mel Brooks is a prime example of someone in that sense who works not only beautifully with scripts, but also with ad libs. He loves to tell how he started out in the Catskills with his shtick, and in the middle, some lady would come in after he was going, and then he would suddenly call out, "Mrs. Schwartz, you're late." And that would kind of diffuse the interruption, incorporate into his number, and he would keep going. But of all the examples that moved me about his genius in ad libbing was something that dates back decades, and some of you may remember it. David Susskind had a show on TV, PBS, and one time, this is 1970, one time he had a show called How to Be a Jewish Son. And he had 6 or 7 comedians, comics, all Jewish, on the program, including Mel Brooks. Well, I think Susskind almost lost the show. Goes around and everybody is talking. I forgot who the comedian was, but someone said he was from Nebraska. The other people said, Nebraska? Jews? And the guy said, yeah, there are 20,000 of us in the state. But, because of that, we're all dispersed. It's hard to get together. And without missing a beat, Mel Brooks said, oh, come on. I bet you get together for the pogroms. That's exactly it. And I said, that's what I admire. that's what I delight in. His not only his ability to ad lib, but to ad lib in a way that is outrageous and reflective. You don't know whether to go, "Oh my God." And the audience just went wild. But that is typical of his comedy. It has an edge, and very fine comedy does. He's able to get at somehow the dark side. And what he was able to do with that remark, I mean, Susskind had no answer. He was just, gobsmacked. But it was a wonderful example of someone who really does have a sense of humor. What does it mean to have a sense? Some people have it, some people don't. And when you think of it, tyrants don't, autocrats don't. And we'll mention why in a minute. But a sense of humor, it seems to me, is a sense, and that's what I think Brooks has almost over anyone else I can think of, an intuitive and an immediate sense of incongruity, of absurdity. When you have a sense of humor, you're able at least to entertain ambiguity, a multitude of points of view. The other person to make that observation, I'm very happy to say, was James Joyce. And Ulysses, which has just celebrated its 100th publication anniversary this year, Ulysses is a very funny book, but it's a humane book in the Mel Brooks sense. And Bloom is a kind of almost Brooksian character. And he brings to the novel what Brooks brings to his comedy, a double sense of the world, of being able to have another point of view. That's why tyrants, who are ideologues, cannot have a sense of humor. Um, I think that, by the way, just because I mentioned Joyce, you all remember the name, aside from Stephen Dedalus, of the main character in Ulysses? Leopold Bloom, as no doubt. And Brooks at one point in the memoir said he was paying homage to Joyce. He was a big reader. And I don't know if he went through all of Ulysses. I mean, I can't even go through all of Ulysses and understand it, even though I'm an English teacher. It's very difficult, but there are substantial passages that really support my sense that there's a camaraderie between Brooks and Joyce. The other unique thing about Mel Brooks, aside from this ad lib, edge, dark humor on in observing absurdity and incongruity, he was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first to, in movies, break the fourth wall. You're at a theater and there are all the walls and the audience, and you're there. And he'll suddenly, as he did in High Anxiety, he mimics the close up camera that goes in deeply to the room by having it crash through a window. And certainly in Blazing Saddles at the end, they're riding the horses, which become the cars, and then they break into a set with Dom DeLuise doing something. It's marvelous. And breaking the fourth wall, when you come to think of it, is a wonderful way of inviting us, the audience, in. And that's another reason for his great humanity. He's not just standing on stage, separating himself from an audience. He is pulling the audience right with him. And to watch a Mel Brooks movie is wonderful. To watch it with other people is even more wonderful, because that's what he invites. And to have a sense of community about the way you deliver comedy seems to me absolutely wonderful and worth celebrating. Most of us admire Brooks, the movies we think of, and just to tick off a few, they started with TV, Get Smart, which was a wonderful series written by Buck Henry, who did Dr. Strangelove. And Don Adams was the bumbling idiot who was talking to his shoe. And for years, little kids were going around talking into their shoes. Um, the producers, the movie with Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder came out, we forget how long ago, 1967. It was a commercial flop, terrific. In 1969, he came out with The 12 Chairs. Um, Hope for the best, expect the worst. And he was a big reader of Russian novels, and that one came from a Russian novel, a satire. And then in 1974, the breakthrough, the big success, Blazing Saddles. Amazing how it still hangs together. Young Frankenstein followed and reminded people how much Mel Brooks loved the movies and loved the genres because he flattered them by mocking them gently. And you can tell the great love. You can recognize he became friendly with Hitchcock after High Anxiety. Hitchcock loved it. Silent movie, just wonderful, where everything is silent except, as you recall, one word. Marcel Marceau speaks, and what is it? No, no. Actually, if you want to be in a Mel Brooks movie, no. Genius. And then High Anxiety, which many people think was his best. He also did serious stuff. The Elephant Man, 84 Charing Cross Road. I thought that was terrific. And then in 1981, History of the World, Part 1. It was a commercial disaster, but he got recognition and got juiced up to do more as a director and a producer, as well as an actor and an editor and a songwriter. Never let a good movie go without a major song. Of course, To Be or Not to Be, which many people think was the genius of all the musical numbers he did. He did that with Anne Bancroft, Sweet Georgia Brown, and the Hitler rap is from that, by the way, that we were going to look at. People still comment. I got online to see what people thought of that. It's 1983. And it's still being watched. In fact, someone said, hey, why don't we have a Putin rap, not just, the Hitler rap? So it stands up as a parody that moves off and has appropriate reference today. And then, of course, 2001, happy to say April, not September, The Producers, the musical, which I saw, which is, I think, the only piece that won 12 Tonys. However, I became a Mel Brooks fan before the movies. I loved the albums. And thank you, Steve, for putting some of them out there. The albums of the 2000-year-old man and the 2013-year-old man. And then I thought of something else that was unique about Brooks that came out of those albums. People went around quoting from them. They forgot what the context was. It didn't matter. These words, these phrases had a life of their own. And that's what happens. In fact, I can just say as a teacher, it happens with me when I think of poetic lines that just pop out of my head because I love them so much. And I may forget where they came from. It doesn't matter. And they also, these interviews started a whole interview trend. Elaine May and Mike Nichols, same period. And it started, with just shtick at parties, and they honed it beautifully. People sometimes compare Mel Brooks with Woody Allen. Well, no, but they do. uh, and they feel that they have to make some kind of choice. They're totally different, but they do come from the same period. And they both come from Sid Caesar days. They were both writers on the show. And they both have a similar attitude towards comedy, but a very different delivery, and I should say life. I don't know of people who will look at Woody Allen movies again, except the music is fantastic. And of course, the music in Mel Brooks films is too. Brooks was 10 years old, is 10 years older than Woody Allen. He's claimed to be more intellectual, I should say intellectual, pseudo intellectual, actually, in some places. And he imitates, he doesn't parody. So as Fellini, I took a look at probably the last movie he made, Blue Jasmine, which was kind of Tennessee Williams Streetcar Named Desire redone, brilliantly acted by Kate Blanchett. But as a script, nothing unusual, but good movies in the sense of good music, I'm sorry. Uh, Brooks, however, when you see a Woody Allen, again, I don't mean to compare, but I do want to take on, one against the other since they both come out of the same culture and time period. When you see a Woody Allen movie, he's funny, no doubt about it. He's got wit, references, and he too breaks the wall. In Annie Hall, he has Marshall McLuhan, come into the movie theater when people are talking about him. But Brooks is, and I use the word deliberately, joyous. That Woody Allen is not. Even the farting scene in Blazing Saddles is joyous. Not so Woody Allen, who I think as time went on, as one critic said, suffered from a creeping seriousness, especially about women and intellectual life. Brooks is snappy. He comes clearly from burlesque and vaudeville, and he's very proud of having studied those comics and comedians. And I think this is something else that shows up and makes him unique. Sings, he dances, he writes, he acts, he produces, he directs. And when you're not looking, he probably would run even in here. He is a man who comes from a multi talented artistic background. He said his heroes that he studied with were the Ritz brothers, Milton Berle, Chaplin, Bert Lahr, Danny Kaye. And it's outrageous, but it's also with that, I don't mean to say edge, but there is always a dark, just a little bit patina of sadness that is always in the corner. Woody Allen was once asked what he thought of Mel Brooks, and he said, there's nothing in common between them. He likes him, he said, but he sees no similarities except that both are short and Jewish. Siskel and Ebert was a show that ran on public broadcasting for several years. And of all the shows they did, perhaps the most controversial one where they really disagreed was on the differences between Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. Siskel came out very strong, Ebert on Brooks, Siskel on Allen. And they both said that both of them were kind of, this was in the 80s, going downhill. I don't know of anything that Allen has done. By the way, his writing for the New Yorker and his books are just wonderful. The essays are very, very funny. He probably is a better writer than a better filmmaker, but he certainly improved as a filmmaker. I don't know what the end of that was. They agreed to disagree, and that was the end of that. But for me, and I'll approach the differences between them, not a comparison, but just the differences. Mel Brooks reminds us of what tragedy and comedy are, and particularly what comedy set out to do. You know, all the courts at one point had a jester. They all needed somebody to bring down the pretensions or the arrogance, or try to bring down, of the king. And Mel Brooks is part of that tradition. I don't know whom I stole this from, but Someone once said that the difference between comedy and tragedy is you have a V, a triangle, and you start out at the top. Something is rotten, the state of Denmark. And then as the play proceeds, the hero has less and less space to move. And finally, at the end of tragedy, he is alone and dies. And there's nothing to me more beautiful in that than the closing, almost closing lines of Hamlet. Um, Good night, sweet prince. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. By the way, Prince Philip, now King Charles, took those lines for his eulogy for his mother. But what happens in comedy? And you're alone, by the way, in tragedy. In comedy, same triangle, but the arrow is going the other direction. Starts out where there's trouble. And usually, if it's an 18th or 17th century comedy, the trouble is always about money, always about inheritance, with everybody scheming to get something. It's farcical, but it's also satiric and sometimes nasty. And then as the comedy moves, it moves up and out. And at the end of comedy, and this is Brooks, who more than anyone, I think, supports this tradition, there's a restoration. And at the end, all's well, even though it's a cuckoo world, that ends well as it can. And that's why I think comedy is so much a part of trying to have people in a community together embrace the culture. And comedy can do that, and tragedy can't. Tragedy may have wise fools, as in Lear's fool, who's always telling Lear and everybody else what's wrong with great wit and savage irony. But comedy doesn't have a downer. The problem today, go back to the anti Semitism and how much ridicule can accomplish, is that if comedy does move up and restore people, even I think of Dante, it's the divine comedy, and it is a comedy. The restoration in Dante is spiritual, but it's a restoration. It's very hard to do today because we don't know what we're being restored to. Comedy comes right out of a particular culture. And when the culture becomes confused, we don't know who speaks for it or who represents it or have a sense how art reflects it and can affect it, there may be a hesitation. And that's what I sensed would be odd if we were all laughing in the Hitler rap and then said, what are we laughing at? What can this do? It's very funny, it's very clever, but you want comedy to make you feel good. Tragedy makes you reflect and possibly be alone. I was also struck, by the way, when in 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky was announced as the sixth president of Ukraine. And I started getting buggy. Every time I looked at this announcement in his early days, it was a standard epithet that followed him: former comedian. He was a former comedian, but no one ever said more that he did. He was also an administrator of the theater. He worked very hard as a director, as a producer. And finally, his great success, ironic, starring in Servant of the People, where he's an everyman history teacher who becomes the president of his country. But, you know, the oddity of that fascinated the journalists, but they kept on referring to him, they don't anymore, as former comedian. And I felt that that was a kind of downplay, as though there was something denigrating about his life. Whereas my whole pitch here to you is that, like Mel Brooks, to be a good comedian or you have even more in your arsenal than a tragedian does. As you see more, as Joyce says, you're on at least two different planes and point of view. Mel Brooks once said in the memoir, "You'll never get an Academy Award with me because I make comedies." And he's right. When you look at the comedies I did, I said, what comedies got major awards? Well, what was cited online anyway was It Happened One Night, 1934. You Can't Take It With You, 1938. And Annie Hall, which I think of is more a romantic comedy. So I want to stress again my great admiration for Mel Brooks as a unique and daring and outrageous in actor comic. Teaches us to question life and ourselves. And that's what Oprah Winfrey was celebrating just this week. He welcomes a sense of the absurd, and we need that today. He triumphs over time. So many comedians walk out and do their number, and there are references that are so particular and so housed in the here and now that next month no one will know who they refer to. Not Brooks. Again, the solid universal tradition of comedy and community, just to alliterate. I'd like to close with a piece of advice that I have lived by or tried to. Whenever I get myself into a wangle or trouble, I think what to do. And my answer is what Mel Brooks said: study a chicken. Or as the 2,000-year-old man would have said, study a chicken. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to take comments. I'm sure Phyllis. And everyone here, Phyllis? Oh,
Who I cherish as the most important person in my life is Anne Bancroft, Anna Maria Italiano. And he was a wonderful husband for her. And by the way, she was one of the people who said to him when he, oh, I think I need some music in this play. And she would say to him, go upstairs and write a new song.
right.
Would do that. I mean, they were a great team. And
But the songs themselves, again, you remind me, I'm sorry to say if I sound redundant, that the songs themselves are so funny and witty, and at the same time, you do what the gasping of that remark of the pogroms does. I mean, even the Inquisition, what a show, and what he shows of the Inquisition, Torquemada, you have this backup, uh-oh. That's wonderful. It only reinforces, again, what I think the genius of comedy is. I don't think
one of my favorite things about Mel is that when people ask me about him all the time, which they do all the time, I always give them the little story that we were driving to the house in Watermill, that was my sister's last place, and we were passing by these wonderful tomato plants, and I said, Mel, stop the car. I'll get out and I'll get some tomatoes. And he said, sure, I got the bail money.
Right.
And that's a typical Mel Brooks story.
Again, the king of ad lib, but that really is spectacular. And when you combine it, there are very few people you can cite who can do script wonderfully well. But now that I think of it, when I see so much that he does on script, I always sense that he's gone a wee bit. you tragedy, Hamlet. Um, there are so many different versions, uh, continually trying out different themes, different isms, but comedy is always singular. It is, and it owes its life to the heart of the comic and comedian. You can't do different, versions of Blazing Saddles, and that's unique. And again, I think I'm just making this up, but in the history of civilization, with tragedy and comedy, and Aristotle, alas, we lost in the fire his treatise on comedy. We have the Ars Poetica on tragedy. But comedy seems to me at once the older, the more communal form of art, and also at the same time, paradoxically, something that we appreciate only when we get older and get a longer perspective on life and can take in those multitude of points of view, those ambiguities. And that's just, and I think it's good to be Mel Brooks. Any other comments? Yes. Yeah.
Exciting.
Sing.
Oh, hello. Okay, Jerry Seinfeld explains the difference between a comic and a comedian. And the comic, you got to have a bit, but a comic is a comic actor, like Dick Van Dyke is a comic actor. He doesn't have a bit, whereas like George Carlin has a bit. So that's the difference, according to Jerry Seinfeld.
Right. Well, I think that kind of dovetails into what I would then call a comedian, is someone who can do comic stand-up and shtick, but someone who can wonderfully, and this is really the test, go off script. And Mel Brooks, it's something else. When I used to watch him and listen, not the albums because those are professional now, but when he would be on shows before editing, I felt this way about Sid Caesar too, and it was just reinforcing my admiration. How far is he going to go? And even more, does he even know how far he's going to go? And that in an audience, creates in you, and that's a thrill. It's another way of breaking the fourth wall and of getting you involved in it. So go the the way of comedy. When you get hold of a good comic novel, treasure it. It probably was much more difficult to write than the tragedy. If tragedy fails, it becomes melodrama, sentimental soap opera. If comedy fails, it's a disaster. And there's much more than risked and much more involved and much more to be appreciated. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Joan, for this presentation, and we'll see you in the next lecture.